All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you could be joining us today. My name is Stephanie, and I'll be one of your co hosts for today's webinar. Now, today's webinar is a part of our larger BrainHQ Academy series where we talk about the neuroscience behind different topics. Today's topic is how grief affects the brain. So let's go over the agenda for today. So, after we wrap up with the agenda, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll with a multiple choice question for you all to answer. And while you guys are answering the poll or chatting in and writing in answers, uh, I will be joined in discussion with Dr. Mouna Attarha and Jill Johnson-Young, and we'll be talking about those poll results. Um, Let me also reintroduce Dr. Mouna Attarha. Mouna, you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be on the call with you today.
Yeah. Mouna is a returning host here for our webinar series. But for those of you who want a refresher, Dr. Attarha earned her PhD in cognitive science, and she has been a senior scientist at Posit Science since 2016. She leads NIH-funded clinical trials that investigates neurochemical changes that occur by training within BrainHQ, and she manages several trials looking at how BrainHQ exercises improve cognitive performance in healthy adults and in those with mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. Joining us today also, we're very excited to have is Jill Johnson-Young. Jill, do you want to say hi?
Thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So Jill Johnson-Young is a licensed clinical social worker and certified grief recovery facilitator in Southern California. She specializes in grief and loss, dementia, end of life, and speaks internationally to therapists, allied health professionals, associations for grief within the funeral industry, and community groups. Her career has included more than a decade with hospice as a medical social worker and as the director of social workers, chaplains, and grief staff. Jill has also authored several books for children and adults on grief, which we will be sure to touch on later. All right. Following Dr. Mauna's presentation, Jill will also be joining back in to have a discussion with Mouna about the topic of grief and how it affects the brain. And then we will pivot to a live Q&A for the remainder of the webinar. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, either for Mouna or for Jill, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll be doing my best to curate those at the end of the webinar. One other thing that I wanted to note is that today's webinar is being recorded, and it will get posted to our YouTube channel in the coming days. If you want a notification for when that video is available, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/brainhq. All right, so let me go ahead and get the poll launched here. So the question that we are going to be asking today is about grief, as you all would expect. But we wanted to talk about when facing grief, what are some of your most helpful coping mechanisms? So some of the answers that we have here are sharing your feelings with loved ones, getting creative, setting aside time to grieve, engaging in physical activities, joining social activities, participating in a spiritual or religious practice, spending time with animal companions, joining a support group, or seeking professional help. And then also we have a chat enabled for right now. So if there are other coping mechanisms that you find particularly helpful that you want to share with us, all the chat messages are going to be sent only to us here on the screen right now. So you don't have to worry about other people seeing those. Those are going to be private messages. But if you wanted to participate, you could also write that into chat. All right, so Mouna, not to get too personal, but do you have any helpful coping mechanisms that are maybe sort of your go-tos when you are dealing with grief?
Let's see. I'm looking at the list now. I think for me personally, it's going to be physical exercise. I really like going on long runs, and I can go into that run feeling frustrated or overwhelmed or sad, and name any emotion. And I come out of that run feeling totally different. It's kind of, for me, running specifically is kind of like miracle grow for the brain. So I think that's the one I would pick. Jill, how about you?
I would join you in the runs, but since I can't run anymore, the long walks. And for me, gardening is my go-to. Getting hands in dirt, growing those tomatoes. Just I'm outside every single day in the sunshine, and spending time with our oodles. We are collectors of the antique dogs who would be otherwise put down by the pound, and so they take a lot of time, but they give a lot back. And so we need those dog eyes looking at us when we're grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. I find for me that one way that I can really stay present and sort of continue to process grief is by being creative. I like doing a lot of DIYs and hands-on projects, and anything from watercolors to like little set crafting pieces. Um, Being able to stay present is something that being creative really helps me with, and in turn, that also helps me with processing the grief that I happen to be going through. And it does seem like that is also a thing that a lot of other people are identifying with as well. So it looks like we have most people have already replied to the poll. So actually, I think what I'm going to go ahead and do is end it, and then we can sort of briefly touch on the results here. Let's share the results. All right, so our number one most popular coping mechanism here is sharing feelings with loved ones, which obviously very, very, very important. It's really important to have that sense of security and community and being able to be vulnerable and share those emotions with people when you're dealing with grief. And like Mouna said, also engaging in physical activities was a big one, and participating in spiritual or religious practices. Um, Jill, do you think that with the sort of clients that you see on a regular basis, is there one that either is here that is often a go-to for many of them, or are there other ones that aren't mentioned that are worth mentioning?
The physical activities, I usually have to do a little bit of a kick in the butt to get people to do it because, as someone mentioned, grief is exhausting. And so it can feel really hard to get out and do that. The animal companions, they're seeing me, so seeking professional help, obviously. And I don't see so many who share feelings with loved ones because they're not sure how loved ones are going to react to them. But the ones who do have someone who's safe, absolutely. Mhm.
All right, fantastic. I'm seeing a bunch of people also agreeing that grief is exhausting in the chat, which, oh boy, it is. It really is an opportunity to try and be gentle with yourself for sure.
Mhm.
Um, all right. So thank you all so much for participating in that poll. Mouna, if you want to go ahead and take over the screen share, I understand that you have a lot to tell us about the neuroscience behind grief.
Let's do it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how our experience of grief can change our neurology. I'm sure virtually everybody on this call has experienced a very stressful event at some point in their life that has caused grief. Maybe we lost a loved one or ended an important relationship. Maybe we lost our job or experienced the loss of our home due to a natural disaster. Or maybe we experienced a life-changing medical diagnosis and lost our independence. The emotions we feel in response to this kind of loss is called grief, and it's universal. It's very natural to feel. But we also know that it can affect the brain and bodies in some pretty profound ways. So let's learn a little bit about how that works so that we can then leverage that information to better adapt to the grief. Now, the natural psychological response to grief, we're just talking about at the psychological level, not yet at the neurological level, has been thought in the past to follow 5 distinct emotional stages. So, in this model, grief begins with denial, where the person is just not willing to accept their loss. They will try in vain to avoid acknowledging that it happened. And this leads to the next stage where failing to deny the loss actually forces the person to face it. And that kind of causes feelings of frustration and bitterness that can manifest as anger and hostility. And when anger doesn't provide comfort, grief then evolves into attempts to bargain. So that might be characterized by the person trying to find a way to reverse the loss in return for a sacrifice. So, for example, they may appeal to their religion or their spirituality. They may say, you know, if you bring this person back, I promise I will never tell another lie for as long as I live. And this line of thinking often doesn't succeed in helping the person cope in a sustained way. And the person may increasingly, you know, ruminate over the loss and think about what they could have done to avoid it. Like, if I had just taken her to the doctor sooner, this would have been caught earlier, it never would have happened. So now we start approaching depression, where the person kind of resigns to the current reality, but still they're in a state of conflict with the loss. But the silver lining here is that the person no longer tries to avoid accepting the grief, and eventually over time that can lead to feelings of acceptance about the loss. Now, while this is the most popular model of grief, it is outdated. What we know now is that not everyone experiences these stages. So, for example, some people never experience depression. Some people never experience anger when they're grieving. And we also know that virtually all people do not experience these stages in a linear fashion. You know, grief tends to fluctuate and cycle across these emotions long after the grief has been accepted. So the process is not denial, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, then acceptance. It can start with anger, then go to depression, then you accept it, you go back to denial, and so on and so forth. So in reality, grief is not some quest to be overcome by simply checking off these stages and reaching some enlightened state, as this model would imply. Here's a more updated model about how we go about our day-to-day life when we're grieving. So here, the two figures on the left and the right represent the stresses we face when a loved one dies. So there are loss-oriented stressors on the left, which are those, you know, sort of painful emotions of losing someone. So, for example, how everything reminds us of them. But then the model also adds restoration-oriented stressors on the right, which reflect what we have to do now that they're gone. So that includes practical things like figuring out how to do your taxes for the very first time, or learning how to cook dinner for yourself for the very first time, if those are the activities that your partner had handled. So restoration stressors help you reorient to how the world has changed and how to live meaningfully and functionally in it. But now notice the arrows that kind of go back and forth. So when you're grieving, you oscillate between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented stressors. And you may spend full days on one of these sides. So for example, you have to sell your home after your partner has passed. So now you're on the restoration side that day. While on other days, you may alternate pretty quickly between them. Maybe you have a moment to have a 10-minute cry in the bathroom, and then you go to your kid's sporting event and cheer for them. So taking time off from the grief through restoration can give you a short break from the emotional impact that it has and the exhaustion. And this model highlights that it's an ongoing, continuous process. It's not something to be overcome. And no matter how much grief work you do, you're still going to experience those unexpected visceral waves of grief throughout the rest of your lives, I feel. Maybe, you know, after you hear a song that you shared with your loved one, maybe after you smell their perfume or the cologne that they wore. And so while grief is universal, the duration, the expression, and the impact of the grief can vary pretty substantially across people. And what I really like about this figure here is that it shows us that, yes, we all go through the grieving process in different ways, but we can characterize that process into some pretty common grieving profiles. So researchers have been able to define several trajectories using prospective data, and each one of these 5 lines reflects a different course of grief experienced by a group of people across 3 time points. So starting at before the loss on the left, to 6 months after the loss in the middle, and then onwards to 18 months after the loss on the right. And on the vertical axis is your level of depression. So higher scores means that the person was more reported being more depressed. And as we go through this, try to see if you have fallen under one of these grieving trajectories in the past. So first, let's take a look at blue. So blue's at the bottom. And some people followed what researchers would call the resilient pattern of grief, where they're low in depression across the board. They were low before the loss, they were also low after the loss. And then others experience common grief, and that's your green line here, where depression was low before the loss, it peaked 6 months after the loss, and then it returned to baseline where it had started at the 18-month time point. And then others experience chronic grief, and this is your red line, where depression was again low before the loss, but it increased after the loss at 6 months and stayed elevated onwards. And then there were people who were depressed prior to the loss. So this includes both the orange line and the purple line, because their depression scores here at the pre-loss time point are higher up along that vertical axis. And some of these people experience a worsening of their depression 6 months onward, so that's your purple line, while others in orange actually showed a very significant improvement in their depression after the loss. So for a portion of the population, the loss actually helped their depression. Maybe they were experiencing a very severe case of caregiver burnout. Maybe they couldn't stand to see their loved ones suffering any longer, or maybe the relationship was just full of interpersonal conflict. So feeling relief as part of your grief trajectory is also common. It's completely normal. And in fact, all of these trajectories are valid emotional experience that are caused by a life-altering event. So these trajectories helped inform three very, very general types of grief. Most people experience acute or common grief. That was the green line that we saw previously. And that occurs immediately following the loss. It's characterized by symptoms that are very intense for those first 6 months, and then the symptoms gradually decrease over time in their intensity. And then for others, the grief lasts longer. So some have this persistent, enduring, disabling grief. In these cases, the grief interferes with their daily life in a way that common grief does not. So this form of grief can be diagnosed by a clinician. And at least according to the diagnostic criteria, the loss had to have occurred at least 12 months in the past, and the person must have experienced at least 3 of the symptoms listed here nearly every day for at least the last month prior to their diagnosis. So for example, maybe they experience things like identity disruption. They feel like a part of themselves has died with the loss. Or maybe they experience intense emotional pain, like their anger, they feel bitter, they feel sorrowful, and those feelings are related to the death. Or maybe they have difficulty with reintegration. So they have problems now engaging with friends or pursuing their interests or planning for the future. And finally, there's a small subset of people who experience absent grief or a lack of an overt expression of grief because they're denying or suppressing it. And it's really hard for researchers to distinguish this type of grief from the quote unquote resilient trajectory because they look the same on the outside. But its suppression actually covers up an intense emotional experience, while resilience does not. And what we know is that those who suppress their grief have poor physical health outcomes. So it's actually healthy to experience the waves of grief and the emotional and physical dysregulation that it causes. That said, the stronger your emotions and the longer they last, the greater the chance you have of developing some longer-term changes to your brain and body. And I say body because while grief is psychological, the brain controls how the body functions. And so grief can cause some pretty significant physical symptoms. You may have noticed disrupted sleep, changes in your appetite. Maybe you eat more, maybe you lose your appetite entirely. You may be tired and fatigued. You may experience pain or digestive issues, have headaches. You may experience changes in your immune system. Maybe you're now more susceptible to infections, or maybe the stress of the grief triggered an autoimmune disease. Studies have also shown that the danger of a stroke or a heart attack is kind of highest in the 30 days after the death of a loved one, especially among those with pre-existing conditions. And I'm not saying any of this to scare you. The body is incredibly resilient and it recovers. But I mentioned them here to kind of drive home the point that our mental state, how we feel up here, affects our physical state, what happens down here. And the mechanisms tying grief to medical outcomes is in part due to changes in the brain's ability to regulate the autonomic nervous system, regulate various immunological and pro-inflammatory biomarkers, and regulate key hormones such as cortisol, for example. And the dysregulation of these systems has widespread systemic effects on all organs and systems throughout the body. So that's why there's significant overlap between a grieving brain and a chronically stressed brain. So, for example, after a loss, your brain signals the release of hormones and chemicals throughout the body as part of the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response. And your heart starts racing, your blood pressure increases, your immune cells actually change in their reactivity, and your hormonal profile changes. And this visceral response gets triggered over and over each day, multiple times a day, and depending on the severity or the strength of the emotional response and the flood, what happens is that the flood of neurochemicals then begin to remodel and rewire the brain's circuitry. So this was the very first functional neuroimaging study on grief ever done. And researchers had participants sit in an fMRI machine and either view a photo of their loved one who had passed or view pictures of complete strangers. And they found that grief is mediated by a distributed network of neural structures that underlie the regulation of the autonomic nervous system, so things that control our blood pressure and our heart rate. It's involved with emotion processing centers in the brain, controlling how we feel. It's involved with episodic memory retrieval networks, so our memory for the events that we've experienced in our lives. And then most importantly, it's also involved in the coordination of these brain functions and structures, how they all work together. And there have since been many other studies, and the journal findings across them, and this is of course simplified, but the journal findings is that there are existing pathways in the brain. Those existing pathways in the brain get rerouted, and new pathways are created that prioritize essentially more primitive functions in some ways. So for illustration purposes, the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive function and decision-making and rational thought, gets disrupted, takes a back seat because it's less active. And the limbic system, like the amygdala, which is all about survival, drives the bus. So in other words, more emotional and fear-based thoughts dominate, and the longer these new pathways are activated and the more frequently they get triggered, the stronger the new pathways become because it reinforces the new brain wiring and effectively locks the brain into a chronic stress response. A study also looked at what looks different in the brain of those who have common grief versus prolonged grief disorder. And there was a single area that was more active in the prolonged grief group compared to the common grievers. And it was part of the basal ganglia called the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is heavily involved in processing reward. And it's also activated when we have a strong attachment to a loved one. So this finding supports the idea that in those with prolonged grief, reminders and triggers of the person we lost, and maybe even that rumination loop itself, actually activates reward circuitry in the brain. And when the grief is rewarding, then it interferes with the person's ability to adapt to the loss. So what we've seen so far is that the brain has rewired itself in response to the grief. Areas that support higher order functions kind of take a back seat to other more primitive functions. But let's see the consequences that has on cognition. So those who are grieving often report feeling spacey, they feel forgetful, they feel like they're unable to make good decisions, they have trouble finding the right words when they're speaking. And these reports have led researchers to compare cognitive performance between people who are experiencing common grief with prolonged grievers against people who are not experiencing any grief. So here, higher on the vertical axis reflects better cognitive performance. And they looked at global cognition, so how well is your brain functioning overall? And then they also looked at specific cognitive domains like processing speed. How quickly can your brain process information? They looked at cognitive control, they looked at verbal fluency, how fluently you can speak, and they also looked at some subdomains related to memory, like your immediate memory recall and your delayed memory recall. And what they found is that those who had common grief, that's your green line here, experienced a statistically significant decline in global cognitive function relative to those who did not have any grief, and that's your blue line. And there are a few other domains that were numerically affected here. And they also showed that prolonged grievers, so that's your red line, showed numerical decrements essentially across the board. Do you see how much lower that red line is compared to the other two lines? And there are statistical decrements in verbal fluency, so how well you can speak in conversation and recall words, and also speed of processing, so how quickly your brain can process information. And speed of processing is arguably one of the most important factors for brain health. So grief affects both the wiring of your brain and your cognition, how it performs. So with this information in hand, how can we target grief from a neuroscience perspective? We know from decades of research that the brain can adapt, it can organize itself and drive structural, functional, chemical changes in its organization based on what we learn and what we experience. So if we know that our experiences can change the wiring of the brain in a maladaptive way, like in the case of grief, then we should also be able to reverse it and promote healthy rewiring based on what we do in our lives after the grief. So if the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate are underactive and the amygdala is overactive in grief, then let's try to do things that are more strongly engaging of the frontal cortex by spending time training our executive function skills. And let's try to engage our anterior cingulate by spending time training our attention and cognitive control skills. And let's minimize the time we spend doing things that make us feel fearful. And that might sound like it's way easier said than done, but these underactive areas, the prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, are heavily involved in networks called the default mode network and the salience network. And the visual exercises in BrainHQ, which I'm sure everybody on the line has played at some point, have been shown to engage both of these networks. So strengthening the underactive areas by training on the visual exercises that require decision-making, attention, and cognitive control is one approach that you can take to kind of restore the maladaptive rewiring caused by grief. And then there's also evidence to suggest that certain exercises on BrainHQ, so now these are the auditory exercises, and those exercises listed under the people skills suite can renormalize the function of the amygdala and improve both neural and behavioral measures of emotion processing. And finally, recall that brain speed was one of those core cognitive domains affected by grieving individuals. So sadness and numbness they're probably one of the easiest feelings that for us to feel when we're grieving. So what happens when we train speed of processing, or how quickly our brain can process information? And here researchers have found that speed training for 10 hours using the double decision exercise, this is the one with the 2 cars and the Route 66 sign in the peripheral visual field, that reduced the onset of depression by 38% and also reduced depressive symptoms by 30%. Those are from the well-known ACTIVE trial. So if your brain is healthier and more resilient, and if it's faster in its operations, then you're less likely to be depressed. You're less likely to experience prolonged grief disorder and adapt more functionally to the grief. And there are many, many other approaches you can take as well. So for example, an 8-week course in mindfulness where you acknowledge your emotions, your thoughts, your body sensations in a very non-judgmental way was found to renormalize brain activity using fMRI and also improve emotion regulation, executive function, anxiety, and depression scores. and 16 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy, which trained cognition and emotion regulation together, pushed the grieving brain in a more healthward direction. So there are a number of things you can do to rewire your brain after a loss. So to recap here, grief is universal. It's very, very natural. It's an expected emotional response to losing something in our life. We experience different grieving trajectories, with common grief improving at the 6-month mark and prolonged grief lasting at least 12 months, with consequences to how we function in daily life. And the grief experienced by those by prolonged grievers actually activates reward circuitry centers in the brain, which may in part explain why it's so hard for those brains to adapt to the loss. Now, the physical side effects of grief are very similar to the physical side effects of chronic stress, because the same physiological mechanisms are activated in both cases, right? Both are changing how the autonomic nervous system works, how the immune system works, how the endocrine system works. And these systems have systemic effects on every organ in the body. And finally, the core message to leave with today is that the brain controls the functions of the body. And you can undo the rewiring caused by grief kind of from the top down by doing activities in your daily life that engage speed of processing and your higher order cognitive functions, such as your attention, the control of your impulses, and your decision making. So grieving really is a learning process, and resilient brains that are fast and have strong executive functioning are more plastic, better able to adapt to the neurological and physiological changes caused by grief and relearn how to live in the world. Now, I just want to say that managing the grieving process in this way does not mean you're going to forget your loved one. You'll still likely experience those very physical waves of grief in the car when you're driving, late at night when it's quiet and you're resting in bed. It just means you'll be a bit more functional in daily life. It means that you'll suffer a bit less, which I think is something that our loved ones really would have wanted for us. All right, should we move on? Jill, people often have various questions about grief because they want to understand how to handle the emotions associated with it. So what do you think about moving on to the discussion portion of the webinar?
I'm looking forward to it. There have been a lot of good questions in the chat, and you've offered a lot of material.
Fantastic. We know, what do you think that the difference in brain health is one of the factors that influences who handles grief in a resilient way versus who suffers in a more prolonged way?
It definitely adds to it, and the need to have our brains functioning at optimal level does allow us to actually recognize that our brains, we're in charge of our brains. We get to decide to a great degree how much we are going to allow the fear factor to come in versus we are going to look at this as this is a process and we're going to be in control of it to the best of our ability. We know also that that the other factors are, how did someone do grief previously? Did they have a traumatic process in the death? And we know that folks who had an anticipated loss tend to not fall into prolonged grief because they've had time to process prior to the loss versus those who had a sudden impactful loss, which is something that someone in the chat mentioned.
So tell me more about the anticipatory. So what's a real life example of that? Is that my partner, they got diagnosed with a medical condition, and I knew that in a year or 2 years or 5 years, something was going to happen.
Or even 6 weeks. You have time to do those stages belong in anticipatory grief. They're really great for that. That's what Elizabeth Kubler-Ross intended them for, was to describe what the dying person is experiencing and to describe what the family is experiencing while with the dying person. So that bargaining piece, right? Yeah. So we had a beloved younger member of our church, mid-30s, who did everything with every kid there. They all adored her, was dying of not one, but 3 forms of cancer. We had to go talk to the kids. And they had time, although a short time, to say goodbye. They did their bargaining. One of them even offered to trade God for her grandma, who wasn't nice, for the person who was dying, to see if they could do a switcheroonie, right? Which is a perfect example of bargaining. And then they all had time to get to the point where there was nothing we could do about this, but we could figure out how to take Mari's memory and do something positive with it and make her go with them. And to this day, years later, those 30 somethings still reflect on that process. That
That was a very valid
reduced the
experience.
prolonged grief process, and it made it a healthy loss.
Yeah. Yeah. So the anticipatory, you have time to prepare.
You
And
have
it's
time
not,
to prepare. Yeah.
in general, improving brain health just makes you better able to handle life's hardships.
It gives you the chance to really be in control of it and to say, okay, so I'm feeling sad. What do I need to do? If I'm Mouna, I'm going to go for a run. If I'm Jill, I'm going to go play with my tomatoes, right? I'm going to do the things that are going to recenter me. Even in the midst of a loss, I can recenter, which is part of brain health.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think many of us, myself included, we want grief to be linear and time limited, right? You experience this horrible hardship, you grieve, and then you're done and you're 100% better.
Wrap
That's
it up, tie it
logic.
up, put it on the shelf.
That doesn't seem to be how the brain works, though. Grief seems to be this process. It ebbs and flows over time. It can get triggered or primed repeatedly by things as simple as a song or a lyric, a smell, a
Smell.
picture.
Mm-hmm.
What is happening in the brain when it gets primed? What is happening when that initial wave of emotion comes flooding back after so long?
That's why I love those fMRI studies that you had, because they do show just how many parts of the brain are included in grief, and grief attacks us physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually. All those things live in different parts of our brains. We don't have these nice, neat packages like they really wanted us to have in the 1800s, right? Where this is the part that does this. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
So when we have a scent that comes in, for me, it might be Christmas time and I smell the pine tree because that's when one of my wives died. That tells me, okay, I'm remembering Casper right now. Let me take that moment. And I can, instead of going into a deep dive, I can take a breath, center, and I can say, I am acknowledging that loss is still there, and I can still appreciate that she was there. And I can remember something good about that and incorporate it with that. And then I can turn it into a memory, not going right back into grief. So what I try to use is relabeling the process with my folks, which is you are not going back into grief, but you are having a memory.
Yeah.
And you can hold on to that and appreciate it and do the positive with it instead of saying grief is going to last forever, because we don't want anyone to feel like this is never going to end. We'll have the memories because they're scattered all over our brains. And you never know what's going to trigger it, just like we don't know what's going to remind us of something our mom said when we were 5. It just does.
Yeah.
But we can appreciate it and tie it into the loss and into the, I'm so glad I had that time with them. That makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of one of the rules of the brain, right? One of the rules is things that fire together, wire together. So the sensation of smelling a smell and the events that follow, seeing your loved one right after, it triggers thousands of neurons to fire at the same time. And so those neurons themselves become more physically connected in your brain. They're now talking to each other, when they send an action potential at the same time. So neurons that are much more connected are more likely to fire together the next time in the future. So when these associations are repeated over and over, this smell equals this person, the brain relearns to trigger the same population of neurons each time. So now that smell triggers the thoughts of the loved one.
And that's where EMDR can be helpful if someone really is in prolonged grief, because they can learn to rewire those thoughts and not go tripping down that path if it takes them into a negative place.
That makes perfect sense. So when you are in a state of grief, you feel numb, you kind of feel removed from daily life, you're sort of saddled up in the sense of loss, you feel like you're unable to carry out regular responsibilities. The general recommendations we hear are, seek support, join bereavement groups, maintain healthy habits, like do your exercise and eat well and sleep a lot. And,
And it all feels impossible.
it all feels impossible.
Stop saying it. Don't
Take
tell
care
your
of
loved ones
yourself.
that. Yes.
Yeah. So, but aside from those general types of self-care, what also should grieving individuals be doing? So you mentioned relabeling and kind of converting that loss into a memory. Do you have any other kind
I
of
think
tricks
we
or
need to
tips or
start with
strategies?
really reasonable expectations. A griever doesn't typically sleep between 2 and 4 in the morning. Our brains are wired from long ago, thank you, National Geographic, for that, to have 2 sleeps, right? We sleep, then we get up and do stuff, and then we go back to sleep, and then we get up for the day. We stopped doing that with the Industrial Revolution. But grievers revert right back to that. And when we are telling ourselves or telling people who are grieving, you need to sleep 8 and eat healthy, you are asking nearly the impossible. Get up at that 2 in the morning, turn on I Love Lucy or The Golden Girls or whatever trips your trigger, and allow yourself some distraction, because distraction is healthy and reduces stress, reduces our cortisol level, which is what we want. Take a nap later in the day. Yes, we want you to eat healthy. I tell my clients, put some broccoli on your ice cream. We want you to have the dark green veggies. I don't insist on kale for anyone because that should be illegal. But, we should have some healthy, but we also need to allow some of the other stuff as long as your doctor is telling you it's not toxic. We also need
So
to
don't wake up and berate yourself then that you're not going
please
to get
don't.
a full night's of sleep.
And don't expect that the people you really thought were going to be there for you are going to be there for you. Lots of folks are afraid of grief, uncomfortable with grief, uncomfortable with whatever disease process your loved one died from. It's almost like it used to be with cancer that could be catching when it wasn't. And so you're going to find that you will lose people, additional people, but you will also find that there are these other folks out there who you never really thought were going to be close, who are moving in and become a support system for you. Allow that to happen. Insulate yourself from the coulda, shouldas. You don't need to do grief the way someone else wants you to do it. You get to do it your way. And if you are Betty White and you are going to volunteer at the zoo and adopt dogs and never remarry ever again, great. If you're Jill and you're going to remarry again multiple times, great. You can be somewhere on that spectrum. It's okay. But you get to do it your way. And then the other thing is, we're coming up to the holidays right now while we're recording this. Holidays are a trap for grievers because Hallmark is out there putting out all those commercials. And so is Ashley Furniture now with you should have everything perfect and the house should be, Christmassy or Hanukkah-ish. And we need to take a step back and say, we don't have to have things be perfect. We don't have to do things the way we used to. We can go someplace else and do something different. We can do nothing, because a griever needs to conserve their energy, take time out for themselves, get outside and get some sun. Vitamin D is free and good for you. Even if you're in the Bay Area, there is sun that breaks through sometimes, right? Get yourself some sun. And the other piece is find ways to memorialize your loved one so that you can make them part of your everyday life and you can share with others who they were and how they are still part of you, because that keeps that continuing bond alive, but in a healthy way.
Yeah, I've heard of that strategy, continuing the bond, right? Some cultures, for example, they emphasize, maintaining the connection to the person after they have passed. So maybe try to talk to them if you believe in an afterlife, maybe try writing them a letter. Maybe if you don't believe in an afterlife, carrying on their wishes or their values in your current life, or maybe doing an activity that you shared with that person.
In a way that works for you.
Yeah, bring comfort.
Yeah. Nearly 80% of those who lose a spouse or a very close, significant person will try to reach out to that person after death. nearly all of them won't tell their friends, their clergy, their doctor, or their therapist. They tell the dog, but they
Get
do
somebody to
it.
confide in.
Yes, yeah, that's why all the psychic shows are so big, because people need that bond.
Yeah. And so a lot of people who have lost someone, they often mistaken a stranger for that person. Like they see them across the street when they're out and about, or maybe they hear their voice or they smell their perfume. And that doesn't mean that they're going crazy, right? Those are just
No, it's
common
completely normal.
experiences. Um, but what's your interpretation of those experiences?
Well, part of it's all the pieces in the brain that are easily cued in. So we see someone who has that haircut, it automatically triggers something, and then we have to recenter.
Mhm.
And part of it, it's just comforting, and I normalize it. And I tell my clients, that's part of life. You're going to see people who look like them. Lots of people will find pennies and say that's from their loved one. Okay, that's fine. Then it's from them. I'm not going to say it's not.
Yeah.
I've sat with too many people dying who've reached out to someone who's not there that they can see. And so, as a hospice staffer, I would never say that you're not having some of those connections. It's how you interpret it, and how you interpret it is your way of doing grief.
And
And
those are
that's
very
normal
normal
and okay.
experiences. Yeah.
Mhm. And don't let anyone tell you it's not normal,
Yeah.
because you don't have time for that nonsense. That's not your energy level right now.
Yeah. And sometimes the loss doesn't happen to us directly, right? It happens to somebody we care about. Maybe we have a friend who lost a parent. How would you support a friend or a family member who's grieving? We generally try to listen to them, or we'll say, let us know if you need anything. But sometimes it's very, very difficult to know the right thing to say. So, what would you say to someone, a family member, a friend who's grieving?
What I first of all don't say is, I understand how you feel. I lost my mom and dad too. Let me just tell you all about it. No, none of that. You show up with the funeral potatoes. That's why they have funeral potatoes. It's because we want to nurture those who have had a loss. So you acknowledge the loss.
Mhm.
You tell them that you get this is hard, that you're sorry if other people aren't understanding, that this is impacting them too, right? Loss of a best friend, loss of a parent, loss of a sibling, those are all big losses.
Mhm.
And the loss of someone else's mom that was close to you is also a big loss. So we need to acknowledge the loss, support the person in the loss, remember the loss, acknowledge it on the big days, and make sure they know that you are a safe person to talk to about it, because you're not going to minimize this loss.
That's great advice. That's really great. And why do you think the grieving process takes so long? Why is it such a long, arduous process?
How long did you know your loved one?
Yeah.
Right? So many people will say, I just want to pick up the phone. And actually, a lot of people do continue to call or text the phone number. They don't turn
Listen to
off the cell phone.
voicemails. Mhm.
They listen to voicemails. And that's where you, as a person outside, don't criticize someone for keeping those phones on. Yeah, it costs $50. It's their $50 to get themselves some comfort,
Mhm.
right? It's because we have lost that tie, and we need that tie in our life. So as we create other ways to hold that tie, that sense of really primary loss starts to diminish and become just part of who we are.
Yeah. It kind of goes, our brains are prediction models, right? And they
Mhm.
trust our lived experience. So you've seen your loved one next to you waking up every single morning for years, maybe even decades. And so that more abstract knowledge, like somebody's going to die that, someday in the future, that's less trusted than the lived experience. So when you wake up one morning and your loved one is not in bed next to you, the idea that they've simply died is just not true in terms of probability for your brain, right? It's not true on day 1 or
Exactly.
2 or day 30. You need enough new lived experience for your brain to develop new prediction models, and that takes time. So I feel like that's why some people say, well, time heals. It's not really the time, it's actually the new lived experiences that
It's
help kind of modify those prediction models in your brain.
it's actively managing it, and it's acknowledging that when someone has just died, every morning they die all over again,
Mhm.
which is a common thing for people to describe. And to also change the pattern. It's that lived experience, that new model. I know you don't want to get out of bed. I know it's hard because you reached over and they're not there. You got to get out of bed, open the curtains, get the sun in your eyes, have that cup of whatever, and do something different so that you're reorienting yourself actively and you're taking charge.
Yeah, they probably wake up in the morning and they say, well, that was just a horrible dream. And then they
And then they're
every
not
morning.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Stephanie, I think with my eye on the clock, we have about 10 more minutes. Should we answer some of the audience's questions?
That sounds great. 10 minutes is definitely not going to be enough to answer all of these amazing questions that everybody is submitting. But let's go ahead and try and get to at least some of them. Carol had asked about unresolved grief. She had acute critical therapy for a year, stopped recently, but she's kind of wondering how long the unresolved grief lasts and what exactly is it? How is that actually manifesting in the brain as well? And she was hoping that you both could speak to that a little bit.
Mouna, do you want to take the first part for the neurology of it, and I'll take the second?
I'm
Or I can jump in.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so
unresolved grief.
Unresolved grief and prolonged grief disorder. First of all, those were developed for researchers to be able to describe the experience of folks and to be able to do some measurement. It's actually created a lot of conflict in the grief therapist world. And boy, some knockdown, drag out fights have occurred over it. But what happens is I remember the comment in the chat, and she had lost a daughter with zero warning. It was overnight and surgery and gone. And I am so sorry for that. That didn't give you time to anticipate the loss. It was an out of order death. Out of order deaths are daughters aren't supposed to die before moms, and husbands are supposed to die before wives. We have rules in this world about this stuff. So you've got several factors that are inhibiting your processing. I'm glad you had some therapy. It should start to resolve as you start to acclimate to the loss actively as part of your world. How are you going to memorialize your daughter and make her part of everyday life? How are you going to talk about her so that not that she's alive, but that she was here and she still counts? How are you going to make her life relevant to your life now? And how are you going to give yourself permission to have joy again and to feel sun again and to do things, to engage again and to engage with new folks so that you can make that part of your new lived experience, but bring your daughter's memory alive? Those are the things that help. I would also think that perhaps some EMDR, if you didn't do that as part of your therapy, would be helpful because you had a traumatic loss, and that's what EMDR is designed for.
That's a really beautiful response. And when you said, you have to give yourself permission, do you feel like people feel like they have to be saddled up in the grief because then they feel guilt, like their loved one didn't mean anything to them if they are all of a sudden functional again in the world?
Oh, there is so much criticism of grievers. How dare you? How dare you laugh again? How dare you smile again?
How dare you remarry?
Don't remarry if you're a woman. Now, if you're a man, you're supposed to in 2 weeks. But right, in a woman, you're not supposed to. But for child loss, we have this thing that says the loss of a child is the worst loss ever. And in fact, the worst loss ever is whatever that particular individual labels as the worst loss ever. It may be a mom. It may be the dog. It doesn't have to be a child, but we label it so it carries so much emotional weight that it takes away the permission to be able to say, my daughter died and I'm still here and I'm okay and I can be okay with this. I didn't cause her death. I didn't have control over it, but I can be okay. I can go do that trip. I can wake up in the morning and listen to the birds, right? I can do those things. But we don't give people permission to have joy again after loss.
Absolutely lovely answer. Thank you, Jill. I have another question from Dennis, who is asking, how does the age of the person affect their ability to cope with grief and recover from it?
Oh, that's all the brain plasticity. That's how many losses you've had that you've dealt with well or not dealt with well. Because if you've had other losses and you come from a family where we don't do grief, we don't talk about it, then that just compounds all of it. It makes it harder. But if there's loss of brain plasticity, cognition, if you're coping with some mild cognitive impairment, then
Yeah.
it does make it harder because the reminders come harder because you forget and then you remember, and then it's like you feel like you're getting slapped around again. And so that can make it harder. The other thing that makes it harder is sometimes people don't believe that older people are functional. And so they try to take away their pain and take away their grief. So you'll see kids coming, swooping in, and they empty the house and they plan the funeral and they move, it's usually mom, across the country. And they've now severed all of her ties to her people and taken away all of her ability to manage her own life. And we know with grief, we need to feel like we're in control because someone dying is the ultimate loss of control. So
Yeah.
we need to not do the swoop. We need to do a slow and steady evaluation for how things are going for the first year. But
So
we all,
yeah, because grief isn't just in response to losing someone, right? There are
right.
many things that can cause grief, and taking them away from their home that they've lived in for the past, 30, 40 years, losing their relationships, all of those are additional forms of grief.
Look at the people in North Carolina right now whose houses literally just melted into the rivers because of the hurricane, and in Florida, whose houses floated away. Those people have lost their community, their homes, their ties, and many of them are having to move. Their kids have lost their schools. That is a huge amount of grief. And they're going to have to reestablish ties, reestablish safety, reestablish they can count on life to be okay again. And that's going to cause a prolonged grief reaction.
Mm-hmm.
All right, moving on to another question here. And this is one that we sort of talked about a little bit before the webinar even started. We have a question about the grief recovery method book and the 5 stages of grief, and whether or not those are more helpful or destructive. Jill, what's your interpretation? I know, Mouna, you sort of addressed some of the problems with that, but Jill, do you want to sound off on that a little bit?
Sound off on the 5 stages. Anticipatory grief, absolutely. You need that. If you have someone dying, you need to do those pieces and talk about it and acknowledge that it's coming. Grief recovery, I love parts of it. I don't love other parts of it. I am not someone who lines up with one particular grief theory because there's bits of all of them that work. And I really think we need to acknowledge how much neurology plays a part, how much energy plays a part, how much memory plays a part, how much prior loss plays a part. And I think that there are parts of grief recovery that can be destructive because it can be judgmental and it can be really regimented. I like the parts that say we need to acknowledge the things that we didn't finish. That's what holds us in grief a lot of the time. Acknowledge the promises we made that we shouldn't probably have made. And we need to be able to evaluate better what we are able to do to carry that loved one's memory versus getting locked into promises that we made in a moment that we probably shouldn't have. And acknowledge that there's conflict in a relationship, because one of the things folks do after someone dies is they angelicize them. All of a sudden, someone is perfect. Oh my gosh, they never did anything wrong. And that's just not real, but it doesn't allow us to grieve because we're not grieving the right person.
Yeah, they're grieving a reality that never really existed.
Yeah. I was sitting in my brother-in-law's funeral and his wife looked at me and she said, "I think we're at the wrong place." And the funny thing was everyone else in the pew said the same thing. So yeah, because the minister was trying to make life sweetness and light. And he was a Vietnam vet with a whole bunch of PTSD, and that's not the way life was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you probably would have wanted to be remembered accurately for who
right.
he was, foibles and all.
I've told my kids they had better talk about me demanding the dishes are done before I get home.
Yeah.
That's going to be mentioned at my funeral.
Mm-hmm. All right. We have a question from Lisa. Is the brain rewiring resulting from chronic grief reversible? I think we've talked about this and it's a yes, but if you guys want to speak on that some more, that would be great.
Yeah, the brain, it used to be the view a number of decades ago that your brain only changes as a child. And once you are become an adult, it's locked in there. Nothing else changes. So Mike Merzenich, he's the co-founder of BrainHQ. It was his decades of research that demonstrated the brain remains plastic throughout the lifespan based on what we do, what we learn, what we experience in daily life. So it's really plasticity is a two-way street. If you can rewire the brain in a maladaptive direction, you can also rewire it in a healthward direction. So no matter your age, no matter your circumstance, the brains retain plasticity into older ages. So yes, you can rewire somebody who with when you're experiencing prolonged grief.
100%.
All right. Thank you everyone so much for joining and participating in the webinar today. I'm sorry if we didn't get an opportunity to answer your question, but we really appreciate your attendance. I wanted to make sure that you all had resources available to you provided through Jill. So I actually have a couple of slides with some information. Jill, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how people can get in contact with you and maybe a little bit about the books that you've authored?
I'm all over the internet, so I'm not hard to find, but you can find me at jilljohnsonyoung.com, which is my main website, and also at therebelliouswidow.com, which is the website that corresponds to my book about how to get through end of life, the dying process, hospice, and then grief after loss. And then I have a variety of kids' books that were written because I was a hospice social worker, and I thought it was really important that we have books for kids that actually had people in them. They do have help for people in the back, but they help parents and other big people talk to little people about loss and grief and all things, including cremation and burial and all that stuff. And then I have a workbook that also helps you work with either by yourself or with a therapist in terms of getting through your grief. I also have a dementia support group that I run that's free nationwide, third Saturday of every month. All comers are welcome. Man, you don't have to sign in. You just got to reach out so that we can give you the link. And then every Friday at 10 o'clock in the morning Pacific time, we have the Friday Grief Chat with Deborah Joy Hart. We talk about all things grief. We have different kind of grief speakers. We talk about it with humor and grace and how to get through all the stuff.
All right, fantastic. And hopefully our audience will take the time to reach out and take advantage of those resources. For those of you that are watching this, don't worry about collecting all the information now. I'll send you a follow-up email with all these resources as well. All right, so let's go ahead and quickly wrap up here with some final words. Let's start with Mouna. Do you have any takeaways that you want our audience to have?
Well, Jill, I wanted to thank you for the really thoughtful discussion, and I wanted to thank our audience for the really wonderful questions that they had. I mean, I hope what we've learned is that grief is a natural response to loss that alters our brains and our bodies, and the brain has a problem to solve when we lose someone, but the brain is also really good at solving problems, and plasticity is a two-way street that can help us pave the way toward healing after a significant loss.
Fantastic. Absolutely well said. Jill, any parting words that you want to share with the audience today?
I just want to mirror what Mouna just said and also add, I really want folks to know that what they're feeling in grief, no matter what it is, it's normal because there's lots that goes on with grief, but absolutely your brain has lots more it can do, and you have to give it the chance to do it. So work with yourself and give yourself all of the permissions to take care of yourself, and also use all the resources that you can find to keep your brain on task and to keep things going for you so that you can get through it faster than slower.
Absolutely fantastic. A little bit of grace and compassion goes a long way. So make sure that you are taking care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Jill for joining, Mouna for running the presentation, and for everybody in the audience for participating once again. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Bye-bye.
Bye.